Sanibel Island is famous for something almost nobody else's beach is famous for: bending over. Visitors here hunch forward for hours, scanning the sand for shells. It's a posture so common locals gave it its own name, the Sanibel Stoop. For decades, this quiet barrier island off Florida's Gulf Coast was considered one of the best shelling beaches on Earth. It drew collectors, retirees, and families back year after year. But on September 28th, 2022, Hurricane Ian made landfall almost directly on top of it. A 12-foot storm surge tore through the island. So did winds of 150 miles an hour. The only road connecting Sanibel to the mainland, a 3-mile causeway, washed out in 5 separate places within hours. 6,000 residents were cut off completely. A year later, only 1,500 of them had made it back into their homes. Only 100 of the island's 500 businesses had reopened. This wasn't a storm Sanibel simply weathered and moved on from. It was the worst hurricane in Florida's modern history. It hit this exact island almost dead center. The damage would take years, not months, to fully address. This is the story of Sanibel Island and what it actually takes to come back from something like that. Chapter 1. A sandbar 6,000 years old. Sanibel Island is young, at least by geological standards. Gulf currents formed it roughly 6,000 years ago. That makes it younger than the pyramids of Giza. It's a genuinely humbling fact for a place so many visitors assume has simply always existed in its current shape. The Calusa people arrived here around 2,500 years ago. They built a genuinely sophisticated society along Florida's southwest coast. They dug canals. They built elaborate shell mounds. Some of these still stand today inside what's now a wildlife refuge. They lived well off the sea surrounding them. They dominated a large stretch of the region for centuries through trade and organized labor. Their engineering skill genuinely impressed later archaeologists. Researchers found evidence of complex water management systems built centuries before European contact. Proof of a civilization far more sophisticated than early settlers ever gave them credit for. European settlers arrived by the mid-1800s. They gradually displaced the Calusa entirely, through disease and direct conflict. It was the same grim pattern that played out across so much of Florida during this era. In the 1830s, a company called the Florida Peninsular Land Company divided the island into 50 long, narrow tracts. Each one ran from the Gulf side to the Bay side. They marketed the whole island as a tropical paradise. Settlers rushed in from the mainland and beyond. They planted whatever crops the sandy soil would support, from key limes to tomatoes to a variety of tropical fruits. By 1868, the island had shifted toward genuine commercial farming. Vegetables grown on Sanibel shipped out regularly to markets across the country, carried by boat to distribution points on the mainland. It was a modest but genuine agricultural economy, built entirely around the rhythms of planting, harvest, and shipping schedules. For decades, this was a working agricultural community, not a tourist destination at all. Farmers built modest homes. They cleared fields. They organized their entire lives around planting and harvest seasons, with little thought toward the shells or sunsets that would eventually define the island's reputation. Then, in 1926, a fierce hurricane tore through the island. It effectively ended that entire industry. Saltwater intrusion ruined the soil. Fields that had supported families for 2 generations became unusable almost overnight, poisoned by the same Gulf water that had always surrounded them. It's worth sitting with this detail. It means Sanibel's relationship with devastating storms didn't begin in 2022. It began nearly a century earlier, with a hurricane that quietly erased an entire way of life here long before anyone thought to build a hotel. For years after that 1926 storm, the island sat in a genuine kind of limbo. It was no longer a thriving agricultural community. It wasn't yet the tourist destination it would eventually become. Some families left entirely, unwilling to rebuild on soil the storm had ruined. Others stayed, scraping by on fishing and whatever small-scale farming the land could still support. They waited, whether they realized it or not, for the island's next chapter to begin. That chapter would take shape around shells, birds, and mangroves, not the crops their families had once depended on. Chapter 2. The fairy years. After the 1926 hurricane wiped out farming, Sanibel spent decades as a genuinely remote, hard-to-reach place. From 1912 until 1963, the only way to actually get to the island was by ferry. The boat ran a half-hour route between Punta Rasa on the mainland and Sanibel itself. There was no bridge, there was no causeway. Getting here required real intention, not just a turn off a highway. Visitors had to plan their trip around the ferry's schedule. They arrived at the dock with enough time to load luggage, groceries, and sometimes even vehicles onto the small boat. Bailey's General Store became the genuine social hub of this era. Visitors and residents alike stocked up there for the week, since there wasn't much else in the way of shopping once you'd made the crossing. Everything from canned goods to fishing tackle to mail service ran through that one building. It was the closest thing the island had to a town center, a place where news traveled fast and everyone eventually crossed paths at least once during their stay. The store still operates today. It's one of the few businesses on the island that can trace its identity directly back to this isolated ferry-only period. It's run for generations by the same family. Its wooden shelves and worn floorboards carry a kind of continuity almost nothing else on the modern island can genuinely claim. That isolation shaped everything about how people experienced Sanibel during these decades. Visitors who made the effort tended to stay longer, since the trip itself wasn't something you'd casually repeat multiple times in a single week. Entire families would rent a cottage for a full month at a time. They settled into an unhurried rhythm built around tides, sunsets, and long stretches of empty beach. A genuinely different pace of vacation than most Americans experienced anywhere else in the country during this same era. Word of the island's beaches, its shelling, and its genuine quiet spread slowly. It traveled through repeat visitors and word of mouth, the same way many undiscovered places built their reputations before mass tourism made everything instantly accessible. This slower, more isolated version of Sanibel is worth remembering clearly. Everything that came after it happened specifically because that isolation eventually ended. The quiet, ferry-only decades set a genuine baseline for what residents believed Sanibel was supposed to feel like. It was a baseline they would spend the following decades fighting hard to preserve. Longtime islanders from this era often described a genuine sense of self-sufficiency. It was a community that had to solve its own problems. Help from the mainland was never more than a boat ride away, and often not even that quickly. That forced residents to rely on each other in ways outsiders rarely fully understood. That independence would prove to be a defining trait of Sanibel's civic character for generations to come. It resurfaced decades later, when residents organized against county development plans. It resurfaced again when Hurricane Ian tested the island's resilience more severely than anything before it. The same core instinct kept reappearing, again and again, across a full century of the island's history. Chapter 3. Ding Darling's Fight. Long before Hurricane Ian, long before the Causeway, one man's conservation fight quietly shaped what Sanibel would eventually become. J. Norwood Darling, known to nearly everyone as Ding, was a Pulitzer Prize-winning political cartoonist with a genuine passion for wildlife conservation. He began wintering on nearby Captiva Island regularly. He was drawn by the same natural beauty that would eventually draw millions of tourists to the region. Unlike most winter visitors, Darling didn't simply enjoy the scenery. He organized to protect it, treating conservation as seriously as he treated his own celebrated career, drawing political cartoons for newspapers across the country. When a parcel of environmentally valuable land on Sanibel came up for sale to developers, Darling campaigned hard against it. He understood decades before most Americans did that unchecked development could permanently destroy the exact qualities that made a place like this worth visiting in the first place. His efforts eventually reached Washington directly. He leveraged both his own considerable public profile and his personal relationships with influential figures in the federal government, connections few private citizens fighting for a small stretch of Florida coastline could ever have realistically hoped to draw on. At Darling's urging, President Harry Truman signed an executive order in 1945 creating what was then called the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge. It protected more than 6,000 acres of mangrove forest, bay, and estuary. That land would otherwise have been sold off piece by piece to whatever developer offered the highest price, permanently reshaping the island's future in ways almost nobody at the time could have fully appreciated. The refuge was later renamed in Darling's honor in 1967, a fitting tribute to a man who fought for this land before almost anyone else understood why it mattered. Today, the refuge is home to more than 300 species of birds, 50 species of reptiles and amphibians, and more than 30 types of mammals. It's a genuinely staggering concentration of biodiversity for a single barrier island, protected entirely because one cartoonist refused to look away from a threat most of his contemporaries barely noticed. This early conservation victory set a genuine precedent for the island. Decades before Sanibel became known for strict development limits, one cartoonist's stubborn insistence that this land was worth protecting had already drawn a hard line in the sand. Later generations of residents, facing their own development pressures, would look back to Darling's fight as proof. A small, determined group of people could genuinely shape the island's future, even against the interests of developers with far deeper pockets. Darling's influence extended well beyond the specific parcel of land he fought to protect. His broader reputation as one of the country's most prominent conservationists brought genuine national attention to Sanibel and Captiva. This happened at a time when most Americans had never heard of either island. That attention, ironically, helped plant the earliest seeds of the tourism industry that would eventually reshape the islands entirely. It drew nature-minded visitors who wanted to see exactly what Darling had spent so much effort protecting, a genuine irony given how carefully he'd tried to shield this exact land from outside commercial interest in the first place. Chapter 4: The Road That Changed Everything. In May 1963, a causeway finally connected Sanibel and Captiva directly to the mainland. The ferry era was over. Lee County had pushed hard for this connection. County officials made their intentions clear from the start. Their explicit plan called for maximizing the island's population, opening it up to exactly the kind of rapid development that had already reshaped so much of Florida's coastline elsewhere. Bridges meant easy access. Easy access meant developers, and developers meant a version of Sanibel most longtime residents genuinely feared, one indistinguishable from the crowded, high-rise coastline just up the road. Island residents disagreed sharply with that vision. They had built a quiet, close-knit community specifically around the isolation the ferry had always provided. They had no interest in watching it get paved over the way so many other Florida beach towns already had been. They organized politically, forming civic associations, and attending county meetings in numbers nobody had expected from such a small, remote population, showing up again and again until county officials could no longer simply ignore them. In 1974, just over a decade after the causeway opened, Sanibel residents voted to incorporate as their own independent city. Their goal was to wrestle development decisions away from county officials who didn't share their values. The vote passed with real conviction. Residents understood clearly that incorporation was their only realistic path toward controlling their own island's future, a decision that would define Sanibel's civic identity for the next half-century and beyond. 2 years later, in 1976, the new city government adopted a landmark comprehensive land use plan. It limited development to roughly a third of the island's total land area, protecting the rest permanently. Building heights were capped directly at the tree line, so no hotel or condominium could ever rise above the surrounding palms and mangroves. Approaching the island from the mainland, visitors would see almost nothing of the built environment at all. Just an unbroken line of green stretching along the horizon, buildings tucked invisibly beneath the canopy. Roughly 70% of Sanibel's land remains protected today. It's a direct, tangible result of a promise this small community made to itself back in 1976, and never once broke, even as developers offered increasingly large sums to change their minds. It would end up mattering more than almost anyone who wrote the plan could have predicted. Nearly 50 years later, a Category 4 hurricane would test exactly how much of the island that promise had actually managed to protect. Chapter 5: What Everyone Actually Came For. Ask anyone who spent real time on Sanibel what they remember, and shelling comes up almost immediately. Sanibel's unusual east-west orientation, Unlike most Florida barrier islands, which run north-south, means the beach catches shells in a way most other coastlines simply don't. Currents deposit an extraordinary variety onto the sand here. Junonius, lightning whelks, alphabet cones, shells that serious collectors travel across the country specifically to find. Some are rare enough that a single genuinely spectacular specimen becomes a story shellers retell for years afterward. Visitors here don't just walk the beach, they hunch forward, eyes fixed on the sand, moving slowly. It's a posture so recognizable and so common that locals gave it an actual name, the Sanibel Stoop. Serious shellers arrive before dawn, headlamps in hand, hoping to beat the crowds to the best finds after an overnight tide. Some carry detailed guidebooks to identify exactly what they've found. The J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge covers more than half of the island's total land area, a direct legacy of Darling's original fight. Its wildlife drive lets visitors drive, bike, or walk through genuine mangrove wilderness. They spot roseate spoonbills, ospreys, and alligators without ever needing to leave a marked path. More than 300 species of birds have been recorded here. This draws serious birdwatchers from across the country specifically for this one refuge. Many of them return year after year during peak migration seasons, adding new sightings to their own personal records, treating a Sanibel trip as an annual pilgrimage rather than a one-time vacation. The Sanibel Lighthouse has stood at the island's eastern tip since the 1880s. It remains one of the most photographed landmarks on the entire Gulf Coast, paired with a public beach that shares its name. Fishermen have cast lines from beneath it for generations. The surrounding beach consistently ranks among the island's most popular spots for both shelling and simply watching the sunset. A stretch of sand where locals and tourists alike gather most evenings without any real coordination beyond habit. Sanibel's extensive network of paved bike paths lets visitors explore nearly the entire island without ever needing a car. That's a genuinely rare feature for a Florida destination built mostly around driving, winding past mangroves, beaches, and quiet residential streets in equal measure. And running through all of it, a real, lived-in restaurant culture gave the island its own particular flavor. Bailey's General Store, dating back to the ferry era, remained a genuine community fixture, still selling groceries and local goods to residents who'd shopped there their entire lives. Doc Ford's, named for a fictional marine biologist from a series of popular novels set on the island, became a beloved local institution in its own right. It drew visitors who'd read the books before ever setting foot on Sanibel itself. The Lighthouse Cafe served breakfast near the lighthouse itself for years, a favorite stop for visitors and residents alike before their day on the beach even began. Its regulars greeted each other by name over coffee most mornings. This was the real Sanibel experience for generations of visitors. Not just a beach, but an entire walkable island built around nature, conservation, and a genuine small-town character that felt increasingly rare along Florida's rapidly developing coastline. Fishing added its own dedicated following to this same mix. The waters surrounding Sanibel and Captiva offered genuinely productive fishing grounds. They drew anglers chasing tarpon, snook, and redfish, alongside the shellers combing the beach nearby, two very different kinds of visitors sharing the same stretch of coastline without ever quite crossing paths. Local guides built entire careers around this reputation. They took visitors out onto the same waters their own families had fished for generations. They passed down knowledge of the tides and channels that no guidebook could fully capture, the kind of expertise earned only through decades spent on the exact same stretch of water. Chapter 6, September 28th, 2022. For days before the storm, Sanibel watched a forecast cone that seemed, at first, to be aimed somewhere else entirely. Hurricane Ian had spent the earlier part of that week wobbling across warm Gulf waters, and early models sent it toward the Florida Panhandle, hundreds of miles north of the island. Then, with almost no warning, the storm turned. It intensified with a speed that caught even experienced meteorologists off guard, jumping from a moderate hurricane to a powerful Category 4 in barely a day. By the time the National Hurricane Center's cone had shifted to point directly at Fort Myers and the islands beside it, there was almost no time left to prepare. Some residents who had planned to evacuate found themselves with only a matter of hours to actually do it, watching a forecast that had seemed to promise them days of warning collapse down to almost nothing overnight. Longtime residents, veterans of previous storm seasons, described a genuine sense of disbelief watching the cone shift so dramatically, unable to fully process just how little time they actually had left before the storm arrived. On September 28th, Hurricane Ian made landfall near Cayo Costa, just north of Sanibel, carrying sustained winds of 150 miles an hour. The island took what amounted to a direct hit. A storm surge reaching 12 feet swept across Sanibel. Longtime residents who had lived through previous storms described this one differently, almost immediately. The water didn't just rise. It arrived with force, carrying boats blocks inland, lifting homes clean off their foundations, and tearing through buildings that had stood for generations. Families who had sheltered in what they believed were safe, elevated homes watched water climb stairs they never imagined it could reach. Some rode out the worst of it in attics, listening to their own roofs strain against the wind, praying the storm would weaken before the roof gave way entirely. Neighbors who couldn't evacuate in time later described the sound of the storm as something they'd never forget. A constant, deafening roar that made it impossible to hear anything else, even a person shouting from the next room. Pets went missing in the chaos, some never found again. Wedding photographs, childhood report cards, decades of family memories stored in boxes on ground floors, all of it simply gone by the time the water finally receded. For many residents, the material losses hurt less than the loss of things that could never be replaced at any price. No insurance settlement, however generous, could ever fully account for that kind of loss, a distinction that took months for some families to even begin putting into words. The Sanibel Lighthouse, standing since the 1880s and survivor of nearly a century and a half of storms, was badly damaged. It remarkably remained standing when the water finally receded, a small, stubborn symbol locals would return to again and again in the months that followed. Photographs of it still upright amid the surrounding wreckage circulated widely as a genuine, if modest, source of hope. The wildlife refuge Ding Darling had fought so hard to protect flooded with salt water, killing fish and vegetation across acres of habitat that had taken decades to mature. Homes across the island, some belonging to families who had summered there for 4 generations, were reduced to bare slabs, the only marker left behind a set of concrete steps leading up to nothing. The causeway, the island's only connection to the mainland since 1963, washed out in 5 separate locations. Sanibel and neighboring Captiva were completely cut off. Residents who had stayed through the storm found themselves genuinely stranded. No power, no running water, no way to know when help might actually arrive. Some spent the following days simply walking their own neighborhoods in a kind of stunned silence, trying to recognize streets they'd driven their whole lives, unable to fully process what they were looking at. Neighbors checked on each other by shouting across debris-filled yards, since phone service had gone down along with everything else. It was a strange, almost old-fashioned way of confirming who had survived when every modern method of communication had simply stopped working. It was a temporary return to a kind of neighborliness the island hadn't leaned on quite so heavily in decades. For an island that had always measured itself in shells, sunsets, and the particular quiet of a slow morning bike ride, this was something else entirely. It was the worst single day in its modern history, arriving almost without warning and changing in a matter of hours. Nearly everything residents had spent generations building. Chapter 7. Bailey's and everything else that almost didn't come back. Long after the storm surge itself became a memory, the truest measure of what Sanibel actually lost showed up somewhere smaller, in the businesses that had spent decades becoming part of people's lives. Bailey's General Store, the same building that had anchored the island since the ferry era, took a direct hit. Flooding tore through the store residents and visitors had shopped at for generations, damaging shelves, inventory, and infrastructure the family had built up over decades. For a community that measured its own continuity, partly through that one building staying open, seeing it shuttered, even temporarily, felt like losing a piece of the island's own memory. Longtime shoppers described the sight of Bailey's dark windows and empty parking lot as one of the hardest single images from those first weeks. Bailey's had never once, in living memory, failed to be there. The store's eventual reopening became one of the moments locals pointed to specifically as proof the island's heart hadn't actually stopped beating, even during its darkest months. The Real Inn, the Lazy Flamingo, dozens of small family-run restaurants and shops that had fed and outfitted island visitors for years, some for decades, took similarly severe damage. The Lighthouse Cafe, that beloved breakfast spot near the island's most photographed landmark, was destroyed outright and never reopened, an ending nobody who'd sat at its counter over the years ever wanted to actually witness. Regulars who had eaten breakfast there every visit for 20 or 30 years found themselves genuinely grieving a building the way you might grieve a person. In a real sense, it had marked so many of their own family's best mornings on the island. One longtime visitor described ordering the exact same breakfast there every single year for over 2 decades. It was a small, quiet tradition that meant more to her than she'd ever fully realized until the building itself was simply gone, a loss she still finds herself mentioning years later, almost involuntarily, whenever anyone asks about her favorite Sanibel memories. Business owners who'd built their entire lives around these small shops and restaurants faced brutal decisions in the months after Ian, decisions that would reshape not just their own livelihoods, but the character of the entire island around them. Some had insurance that covered a fraction of what rebuilding would actually cost. Others simply didn't have insurance that covered flood damage of this scale at all, since so few storms in the island's history had ever demanded it. Many owners were themselves longtime residents who'd lost their own homes in the same storm that had destroyed their livelihoods, forcing them to rebuild 2 separate lives at the exact same time, with the exact same limited resources. Some spent their nights in a camper parked beside their own gutted restaurant, working by day to salvage what they could. They were uncertain whether reopening was even financially possible anymore, doing the math over and over in their heads and coming up short every single time. And yet, one by one, over months and then years, many of these businesses did come back. Neighbors who'd shopped at the same stores their whole lives pitched in with cleanup before any official aid ever arrived, showing up with their own tools and their own hands, asking nothing in return beyond the chance to help. Contractors who lived on the island themselves prioritized local businesses over larger, more profitable mainland contracts, understanding instinctively what those storefronts actually meant to the people around them. Every reopened sign, every business that found a way back, became its own small, genuine celebration on an island that had learned the hard way not to take a single one of them for granted again. Each grand reopening drew crowds of longtime customers who showed up simply to stand in line and say, "Welcome back." Chapter 8. Battered, Not Broken. A year after Hurricane Ian, the scale of what Sanibel still faced became painfully clear. Of the roughly 6,500 residents who had called the island home before the storm, only 1,500 had made it back into their houses. Of more than 500 businesses that had operated across the island, only about 100 were back up and running. No condominium buildings had reopened at all. Skeletal, gutted structures stood among the palm trees, contractor trucks moving constantly between them, the sound of construction becoming the island's strange new daily soundtrack, replacing the quiet that had once defined a typical Sanibel afternoon. One longtime resident, returning to the island for the first time months after the storm, described walking through her own neighborhood and genuinely struggling to identify which lot had belonged to which house. So many were reduced to nothing more than a bare concrete slab and a mailbox still somehow standing upright. She'd raised her children in one of those houses. She stood there a long time before she could bring herself to leave. Neighbors who found each other again in the weeks that followed described embraces that lasted far longer than a normal greeting. Both people were simply relieved the other had actually survived, their homes suddenly secondary to the fact that they were both still standing there together. One elderly couple, married on the island decades earlier, described finding their own wedding photograph miraculously intact in the wreckage of their living room, tucked beneath a fallen beam. It was the single object they chose to salvage before anything else, even before checking on the rest of their belongings. Mayor Richard Johnson captured the island's mood directly in an interview a year after the storm. "We're a little bit beat up these days," he said. "Battered, but not broken." It was an honest assessment. It neither minimized the genuine scale of the disaster, nor gave in to despair about the island's actual future. That tone resonated deeply with residents who needed both honesty and hope in equal measure during that difficult first anniversary. Words many islanders would go on to repeat to each other in the months and years that followed. There was, buried inside all that damage, a genuinely important silver lining, one that traced directly back to decisions made decades earlier. Roughly 70% of Sanibel's land had remained protected and undeveloped under the 1976 Land Use Plan. Mayor Johnson himself credited those protected natural spaces with sparing the island from even worse destruction than it actually experienced, a fact that gave many longtime residents a genuine sense of vindication amid so much loss. Undeveloped mangrove forest and wetland absorbed and dispersed storm surge in ways a fully built-out coastline simply couldn't have. The same conservation fight Ding Darling had waged nearly 80 years earlier ended up functioning as a genuine, if unintentional, form of protection when it mattered most. So did the same land use plan residents had fought for after the causeway first threatened their quiet community. It was a decision made by people who never could have specifically pictured Hurricane Ian. But they understood something true about protecting land, regardless of what future storm might eventually test it. Chapter 9: The Long Rebuild. Ask people who lived through Sanibel's recovery what they actually remember, and it's rarely the causeway or the construction permits. It's the neighbors. In the weeks after Ian, before any large-scale aid infrastructure had fully arrived, residents who'd managed to keep their own homes largely intact opened them up to neighbors who hadn't. Families who barely knew each other before the storm found themselves sharing generators, splitting the cost of a single working water pump, and taking turns checking on elderly residents who couldn't easily leave the island themselves. Neighbors who'd only ever exchanged a friendly wave in passing suddenly found themselves cooking meals together on a single working stove, or ferrying medications across the island to residents whose own pharmacies had been destroyed. Volunteers, many of them former or current island residents living elsewhere, drove or flew in specifically to help gut flooded homes. They hauled out ruined furniture and drywall for people they'd never met before that week. Some took unpaid leave from their own jobs simply because they couldn't bear to watch the recovery unfold from a distance, driven by a loyalty to the island that outlasted their own decision to move away from it years earlier. Rebuilding a single home for most residents meant navigating insurance claims, contractor shortages, and permitting delays that stretched what should have been a matter of months into a matter of years. It was a bureaucratic marathon few families had ever imagined they'd need to run. Some families lived in campers parked on their own property while their homes slowly went back up around them, refusing to leave the island even when leaving might genuinely have been easier. They were unwilling to abandon the exact patch of ground where they'd raised their own children. Others rebuilt from out of state, flying back every few weeks to check on progress, unwilling to give up a home that had, in many cases, been in the family for multiple generations. Elderly residents in particular faced an especially difficult choice, weighing years of construction delays against however many years they realistically had left to actually enjoy the home they'd be waiting on. It was a calculation nobody should ever have to make about the place they'd spent a lifetime calling home. The causeway itself did eventually get rebuilt, engineered to withstand future storms of similar intensity, reopening to full traffic by Christmas of 2023. But residents consistently described the real rebuilding as something that happened in far smaller, more personal moments than any single infrastructure milestone, moments that never made a single headline but mattered far more to the people actually living through them. The first time a familiar restaurant turned its lights back on, the first grandchild's visit after 2 years away, finally seeing the beach look something like it used to, running down to the water the exact same way their parents once had at that same age. The day a longtime neighbor's for sale sign, put up in the storm's grim aftermath, finally came down because they'd decided, after all, to stay and rebuild instead. Small, quiet moments like these accumulated slowly across the island, each one a genuine, individual decision to keep believing in a place that had, for a while, tested that belief severely. By 2025, that patient, person-by-person rebuilding had added up to something visible. The Shalimar Beach Resort reopened in September, the first entirely new hotel built on Sanibel in more than 4 decades. More than 40 restaurants across the islands were serving customers again, a mix of beloved survivors and entirely new spots built by people determined not to let the storm have the final word. None of it happened because of a single government program or corporate investment. It happened because thousands of individual people, most of them residents nobody outside the island will ever know by name, simply decided not to walk away. They chose instead to spend years of their own lives rebuilding a place most of them could have simply left behind for somewhere easier. Chapter 10. Quieter, Not Gone. Today, more than 3 years removed from Hurricane Ian, Sanibel Island exists as a genuinely different place than it was before the storm, but not in the way most disaster stories eventually resolve. Traffic across the island runs noticeably lighter than it did in the years before Ian. Fewer total tourists make the trip these days, a direct, measurable consequence of a recovery that, while genuinely impressive, still hasn't fully replaced everything the storm destroyed. Longtime visitors who've made the trip both before and after the storm consistently describe the same shift, a quieter, more authentic version of the island they remember. Many genuinely say they prefer it that way, describing a version of Sanibel that feels closer, in spirit, to the slower ferry-era island their own parents or grandparents first fell in love with decades earlier. And through all of it, the beach itself never actually stopped doing what it's always done. The shells kept washing in, tide after tide, the same way they had for generations before Ian, and the same way they still do today. The dolphins still play in the past, connecting the island to open water. The birds still fill the wildlife refuge Ding Darling fought to protect 8 decades ago. The sunsets, visitors consistently report, haven't changed even slightly. The same brilliant colors settle over the Gulf every single evening, indifferent to whatever construction or recovery is still quietly underway just a few blocks inland, a nightly reminder that some things about this place remain entirely outside any storm's reach. Sanibel isn't fully back to what it was before September 2022, and by most honest measures, it may never be exactly that again. What it's becoming instead is something worth paying real attention to. An island that took the worst hurricane in Florida's modern history almost directly on the chin. It's choosing, deliberately and person by person, to rebuild itself into something new rather than simply trying to recreate exactly what existed before. The same stubborn protective instinct that drove Ding Darling in the 1940s and residents fighting county planners in the 1970s is, in its own way, still shaping every decision being made here today. It shows up in every reopened storefront and every rebuilt home. It's carried forward now by a generation that has learned firsthand exactly what it costs to lose a place like this and exactly what it takes to bring it back. So that's the story of Sanibel Island. Now I want to hear from you. Did you visit Sanibel before Hurricane Ian, or have you made the trip since the island started rebuilding? Have you done the Sanibel Stoop yourself, hunting for shells along the beach at sunrise? Do you remember Bailey's General Store, or a breakfast at the old Lighthouse Cafe before it was lost to the storm? Tell us your Sanibel Island story in the comments below. And if this story showed you what it actually takes for ordinary people to rebuild a place they love, one home and one small business at a time, hit that like button and subscribe. We cover the places still finding their way back and the people quietly doing the work nobody else sees.